Cynthia Rogers stood beside her mother's fresh grave, dirt still clinging to her black dress, when she decided to give her husband one last chance to be the man she'd married. The November wind cut through the cemetery like a blade, scattering dried leaves across headstones that stretched toward the grey horizon. Cynthia watched the last mourners drift away, their black coats disappearing between rows of monuments, leaving her alone with the raw earth that covered her mother 7 days. That was how long she had sat vigil in the hospital room, holding her mother's cooling hand while machines beeped their futile protests. 7 days of making impossible decisions about ventilators and morphine drips and organ donation forms. 7 days of planning a funeral, selecting a casket, choosing flowers, writing an obituary that somehow captured 68 years of life in 3 sterile paragraphs. 7 days of sleeping in stiff hospital chairs while Clyde stayed home with what he claimed were severe chest pains. The family attorney approached as cemetery workers began folding chairs. Bernard Wallace was a man who looked exactly like what he was, someone who had spent 40 years protecting wealthy people from their own relatives. His silver hair was immaculate despite the wind, his charcoal suit pressed to knife edges, his face betraying nothing but professional concern. "Mrs. Rogers, I apologize for the timing, but we need to discuss your mother's estate." His voice was low, respectful, the kind of tone reserved for discussing death and money in the same breath. "Is there somewhere private we could talk?" Cynthia followed him to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree, its bare branches reaching toward the colorless sky like skeletal fingers. She sat carefully, her body moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had forgotten how to feel anything beyond exhaustion. Bernard opened a leather portfolio, extracting documents that looked official and complicated. "Your mother was an extremely private woman regarding her finances. I respected that privacy absolutely during her lifetime as she requested, but now you need to understand the full scope of what she built. Mr. Wallace, if this is about her house and car, we can handle that next week. I just need—" "Your mother left you a commercial real estate portfolio worth approximately $300 million. The words hung in the cold air between them, impossible and absurd. Cynthia stared at the lawyer, waiting for the punchline, the mistake, the clarification that would make those words make sense. "That's not possible. My mother lived in a modest house. She drove a 15-year-old sedan. She clipped coupons, for God's sake." Bernard's expression softened slightly, something that might have been admiration crossing his weathered features. "Your mother was many things, Mrs. Rogers, but wasteful was not one of them. She began investing in distressed commercial properties during the recession of the early 80s. She bought apartment buildings that banks were desperate to unload, strip malls that were failing, office complexes that seemed worthless. Then she held them. Through every market cycle, every recession, every boom, she held them and let them appreciate while collecting rent that she immediately reinvested. 40 years of compound growth, careful management, and absolute discretion. Cynthia's mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her mother, the woman who had raised her alone after her father disappeared when Cynthia was 4, the woman who worked as a hospital administrator and never mentioned investments or portfolios or wealth. Why didn't she tell me? She wanted you to build your own life first, make your own choices, marry for love, work because you wanted to, become your own person without the weight of expectation or the target that wealth creates." Bernard paused, his next words careful. "She also wanted to see who you married, what kind of man you chose, whether he would stay when things got difficult." The implication settled in Cynthia's chest like a stone. She didn't trust Clyde. "Your mother never said that directly. But she did tell me that if anything happened to her, I should ensure these assets were protected and kept absolutely confidential until you decided how to handle them. She said some people show their true nature when they smell money, and you'd know what to do when the time came." Cynthia thought about Clyde at home, supposedly too ill with chest pains to attend his mother-in-law's funeral. Clyde, whose construction company was bleeding money and creditors. Clyde, who had been distant and irritable for months, staying late at job sites and taking phone calls in the other room. This could save his business, she said quietly, hating how hopeful she sounded. Bernard closed his portfolio with a soft snap. It could save many things, Mrs. Rogers. The question is whether those things deserve saving. I'll be in my office tomorrow morning if you'd like to discuss specifics. For now, take time to process this. And please, accept my deepest condolences on your mother. She was an extraordinary woman. He walked away, leaving Cynthia alone with dirt under her fingernails and information that felt like a bomb ticking in her chest. She pulled out her phone, staring at Clyde's contact photo, his broad smile, his arm around her shoulders from their anniversary dinner 2 years ago, before the distance, before the unexplained absences, before he became someone she barely recognized. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe this blessing could repair what was breaking between them. Maybe they could use this gift to rebuild not just his business, but their marriage, their partnership, their future. She pressed his number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered, breathless and annoyed, music and laughter loud in the background. "He's busy. Don't call here again." Cynthia's breath stopped. In the background, she heard it clearly. Clyde's distinctive laugh, the one that used to make her stomach flutter, now making her blood turn to ice glass clinking. A bass beat from speakers. The woman's voice softer now, but still audible. "Baby, it's just some wrong number." The line went dead. Cynthia sat frozen on the bench, phone pressed to her ear, listening to silence. Cemetery workers packed equipment onto a truck 50 yards away, their movements efficient and practiced. The sky was darkening, clouds rolling in with the promise of rain. Her mother's grave was covered now, a temporary marker where the headstone would eventually stand. She redialed. The call went straight to a blocked number message. Slowly, mechanically, Cynthia stood and walked to her car. She moved like someone underwater, each step deliberate and strange. The funeral program was still clutched in her left hand, her mother's photo smiling up at her from cheap cardstock, phone in her right hand, screen dark now, holding evidence of something irrevocable. She didn't cry. Not a single tear. Instead, she stood beside her car in the empty cemetery parking lot as the first raindrops began to fall, her mind turning cold and sharp and focused as a scalpel. Somewhere in the back of her consciousness, she heard her mother's voice from 1,000 childhood moments. "Baby girl, never let anyone make you small, and never, ever let anyone think your kindness is weakness." Cynthia looked back one last time at the grave disappearing in the rain. Then she got in her car, started the engine, and began calculating exactly how much her husband's betrayal was going to cost him. Everything, she decided. It was going to cost him absolutely everything. Chapter 2. The Evidence. The drive home took 45 minutes through rain that turned the highway into a blur of red taillights and grey pavement, but Cynthia's hands never trembled on the steering wheel. She didn't turn on music, didn't call anyone, didn't cry or scream or do any of the things a devastated woman might be expected to do. Instead, she drove in absolute silence, her mind working with a clarity she had never experienced before, cold, precise, and utterly without mercy. The woman's voice played on repeat in her head. "Baby, it's just some wrong number." The casual intimacy of that single word, baby, told Cynthia everything she needed to know. This wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was established, comfortable, routine. She parked 3 houses down from their 2-story colonial, the one her grandmother had left her 5 years ago. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, streetlights reflecting off wet asphalt in yellow pools. Their house glowed warm in the darkness, every light on like a beacon of domestic comfort. Clyde's truck sat in the driveway, splattered with mud from the job sites he claimed kept him so busy. Cynthia checked her watch, 6:15 in the evening. She settled into her seat and waited. At 7:40, headlights swept down the street. Clyde's truck pulled into their driveway, and her husband climbed out, moving with his normal, easy stride. No hand pressed to his chest, no grimace of pain, no struggle to walk or breathe. He jogged up the front steps and disappeared inside, the door closing behind him with a solid thunk that echoed down the quiet suburban street. She waited another hour in the darkness, rain pattering against the windshield, watching shadows move across the windows of the house she had inherited from a grandmother who had the good sense to put everything in Cynthia's name alone. Smart women, the women in her family. Quiet and careful and impossibly smart. At 8:45, she finally went inside. The television was on in the bedroom, some crime drama playing at high volume. She found Clyde exactly where she expected, reclined against pillows, one hand draped dramatically across his forehead, the other holding the remote a beer bottle sweated condensation onto the nightstand beside him. He groaned when he saw her, the sound theatrical and practiced. "Babe, how was it? God, I tried so hard to push through the pain, but I just couldn't make it. The chest pressure was unreal. I almost called an ambulance around 3 o'clock, but I didn't want to worry you during the service." 3 o'clock, exactly when that woman answered his phone. Cynthia set her purse down carefully, removed her coat, hung it in the closet with movements that felt like a performance she was learning to execute. "It was sad," she said quietly, "but the turnout was good. People said nice things. I'm so sorry I missed it." His voice cracked with what might have been genuine emotion if Cynthia didn't know better. "You know I loved your mom. If my body hadn't completely betrayed me, did you take your medication?" The question seemed to surprise him. He blinked, recalibrating. Yeah, the aspirin and that other stuff. Helped a little." "When did the pain start?" "Around 9 this morning, just this crushing feeling right here." He pressed his fist against his sternum, his face contorting. "Like someone sitting on my chest, I could barely breathe." Cynthia moved to the bathroom, turning on the water to wash her hands, studying her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her had her face but different eyes, harder, older, done with believing pretty lies. "Did you eat today?" "Couldn't stomach anything. Too much pain." She came back to the bedroom doorway, leaning against the frame. "You must have been so scared, alone here with chest pain that severe." "Terrified," he admitted, reaching for his beer. "But I didn't want to call you away from the funeral. Your mom deserved your full attention today." The concern in his voice was perfect, the performance flawless. If Cynthia hadn't heard that woman's voice, hadn't caught his laugh in the background, she might have believed every word. She wondered how many other lies she had swallowed over the months, trusting him because questioning felt like betrayal. "Do you need anything? Water? Food?" "Nah, I'm okay. Come here." He patted the bed beside him, his smile gentle and reassuring. "You must be exhausted. Let me hold you." Cynthia climbed onto the bed, letting him pull her against his chest, smelling beer and cologne, and the faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. She closed her eyes and played the grieving wife who needed comfort, asking soft questions about his pain levels, whether it hurt when he breathed, if he should see a doctor tomorrow. He answered each question with elaborate detail, digging his grave deeper with every word. When he went to shower, Cynthia moved with surgical precision. His phone sat on the nightstand, face down like always. She picked it up, entered his passcode, their anniversary date, how sentimental, and opened his messages. The contact was saved simply as J. She scrolled back through months of conversations, her face expressionless as she photographed screen after screen with her own phone. The messages painted a picture more devastating than she had imagined. The affair started 8 months ago, right when his business troubles began escalating. There were explicit photos, plans for weekends away, promises about their future together once he'd dealt with his marriage. But the worst messages were the ones about Cynthia herself. The anchor is in one of her moods again. "Can't wait until I don't have to pretend to care about her boring stories. Her mom's in the hospital. Maybe this is finally my way out." And then, from 3 days before the funeral, "Once the old hag kicks it, I'll tell C I want out. She'll be so broken down she won't even fight me. Then we can finally be together for real." Cynthia read that message 3 times, her hands steady, photographing everything the shower was still running. She closed his phone and set it exactly where she'd found it, screen down, angle perfect. She deleted the photos from her cloud backup and emailed them to herself at an address Clyde didn't know existed, then cleared her email history. Evidence preserved, trail erased. When he emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist and steam billowing behind him, she was lying in bed with her eyes closed, breathing the slow rhythm of exhausted sleep. He kissed her forehead gently. "Love you, babe." She didn't respond, keeping her breathing even and deep. He settled into bed beside her, close enough that she felt his warmth, and within minutes he was snoring softly, the sound of a man without a care in the world, sleeping the sleep of someone whose conscience didn't trouble him at all. Cynthia lay in the darkness, eyes open now, staring at the ceiling fan, making lazy circles overhead. She thought about the $300 million Bernard Wallace had described, the empire her mother had built in absolute silence, the test her mother had designed without ever saying a word. Clyde had failed spectacularly. She listened to him snore, one arm thrown over his head, peaceful and content. She whispered to the darkness, her voice barely audible above his breathing, "You have no idea what you just lost." Then she closed her eyes and began planning war. Chapter 3. The Attorney's Office. Cynthia sat in Bernard Wallace's office at 8 o'clock the next morning, having left Clyde sleeping off his fake illness, with a note claiming she needed to handle insurance paperwork at the funeral home. The office occupied the 42nd floor of the city's tallest building, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of a skyline still shrouded in morning fog. Bernard's desk was mahogany and ancient, covered with precisely organized stacks of documents and a leather blotter that looked like it predated computers. The walls held framed diplomas from universities that charged tuition in 6 figures, and photographs of Bernard shaking hands with governors, senators, and people whose names appeared on buildings downtown. This was the office of someone who had spent decades protecting generational wealth through the ugliest family wars imaginable. Cynthia had chosen wisely when she'd called him at 7:30, her voice steady as stone. Bernard set a cup of coffee in front of her, real porcelain, not paper, and settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose back reminded him daily that he was 70 years old. "You sounded different on the phone this morning," he observed, his sharp eyes studying her face. "Yesterday you were grieving. Today you're something else entirely." "Today I'm awake," Cynthia replied, pulling out her phone. "I need to show you something, but first I need your promise that everything my mother left me stays completely confidential. No public records, no announcements, nothing that could surface in a database search or show up in any kind of asset search." Bernard's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Interest, recognition, maybe respect. "Estate privacy is standard for clients at your level, Mrs. Rogers. There are entirely legal methods to structure holdings through trusts and corporations that keep your name off public records. I assume there's a specific reason you're requesting this." She handed him her phone, already open to the photographs of Clyde's messages. "That reason." Bernard read in silence, his face betraying nothing as he scrolled through months of betrayal documented in text messages and explicit photos. When he finished, he set the phone down carefully and removed his reading glasses, cleaning them with a cloth he pulled from his desk drawer. "Your mother told me 3 years ago that if anything happened to her, I should protect you from vultures." His voice was measured, professional, but there was steel underneath. "She said, and I quote, 'My daughter married a handsome fool who'll show his true colors the moment I'm gone. When that happens, Bernard, you help her bury him.'" I thought she was being dramatic, mother's worry. She wasn't being dramatic. No, she was not. Bernard replaced his glasses and opened a drawer, extracting a yellow legal pad. "Tell me what you want." Cynthia leaned forward, her voice quiet and absolutely certain. "I want to know everything about Clyde's business. His debts, his creditors, his partners, his assets, every vulnerability he has. I want to know exactly how close he is to total collapse. And the woman? Her too full background, where she works, where she lives, her financial situation, everything." Bernard wrote quickly, his pen scratching across paper with the sound of someone who had conducted this exact conversation hundreds of times before, though usually with angry sons fighting sisters and bitter ex-wives hunting hidden assets. This will take my investigator approximately 1 week, possibly less. He's extremely thorough and entirely discreet. No one will know they're being investigated. Bernard looked up, his gaze direct. Mrs. Rogers, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you planning to file for divorce immediately? No. May I ask why not? Cynthia smiled, and it was the coldest expression Bernard had ever seen on a grieving widow. Because Clyde doesn't know about the inheritance. He thinks my mother left nothing but funeral expenses. He's 3 months from bankruptcy, desperate for money, and planning to divorce me anyway. According to the messages, I want to watch him dig his own grave first. I want him to ask me for help while sleeping with his mistress. I want to document every lie, every manipulation, every cruel text message. Then when he's at his absolute lowest point with nowhere to turn, I want him to find out exactly what he lost. Bernard was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he nodded. Your mother said you were stronger than you looked. She said underneath all that kindness was someone who understood consequences. He picked up his phone, pressing a button. Frank, come to my office, please. I have a new project for you. The door opened moments later, admitting a man who looked exactly like every private investigator in every noir film. 60-something, weathered face, rumpled suit, eyes that had seen humanity at its absolute worst, and was no longer surprised by anything. Frank, this is Mrs. Rogers. Her husband and his mistress need comprehensive background checks. Financials, business dealings, personal vulnerabilities, everything we discussed. 1 week turnaround. Frank nodded, not even bothering to pull out a notebook. Names? Cynthia provided details, her voice steady. When she finished, Frank left without another word. The door clicking shut behind him, Bernard pulled out another set of documents, sliding them across the desk. Now let's discuss your mother's portfolio in detail. You need to understand exactly what you're protecting. For the next hour, Bernard walked Cynthia through 40 years of careful wealth accumulation, commercial properties across 6 states, all generating steady monthly income. Her mother had bought distressed real estate during every recession, holding properties through downturns when everyone else was panic selling, then riding the recovery waves to exponential growth apartment buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods. Office complexes purchased for pennies during the savings and loan crisis, strip malls that became premium locations as cities expanded. The total portfolio generates approximately $6 million in net operating income annually, after all expenses and property management fees, Bernard explained, pointing to spreadsheets that tracked decades of compound growth. That money has been automatically reinvested into maintenance, improvements, and acquiring additional properties. Your mother never touched the income. She lived entirely off her hospital salary and let this empire grow in silence. Why? Because your grandmother lost everything to a con man who married her for money. Your mother watched her own mother die poor and bitter, regretting that she'd ever trusted anyone with knowledge of her wealth. So when your mother built her own fortune, she told no one. She wanted you to have security and freedom without the burden of expectations or the target that visible wealth creates. Cynthia thought about her modest childhood, her mother's careful budgeting, the embarrassment she'd felt as a teenager when classmates drove new cars while they kept that ancient sedan running with duct tape and prayer. She was protecting me even then. She was. Bernard closed the portfolio. Now the question is what you want to do with this protection. You could write a check today and save your husband's business. You could demand couples therapy and complete transparency as conditions for financial assistance. You could fight for your marriage if you wanted to. The question hung in the air between them. Cynthia thought about Clyde's laugh in the background of that phone call, the text messages calling her the anchor, his comment about her dying mother being convenient timing. Let it burn, she said quietly, her voice steady as stone. Let his business collapse completely. Then I want to buy the ashes for pennies. Bernard smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office, and it was the expression of someone who had finally found a client worth representing. "Now we're talking strategy, Mrs. Rogers. Let me tell you exactly how we're going to make that happen." They spent another hour planning Clyde's destruction with the methodical precision of surgeons mapping an operation. When Cynthia finally left, walking past assistants and junior partners who had no idea what had just been set in motion, she felt lighter than she had in months. She stopped at the elevator, looking back at Bernard's closed door. Her mother had chosen this man carefully, setting pieces in motion years before her death, creating a safety net that had seemed unnecessary until the exact moment it became essential. "Thank you, Mom," Cynthia whispered to the empty hallway. Then she stepped into the elevator and descended back to her ordinary life, where no one knew she had just become wealthy beyond measure and absolutely ruthless in her determination to make her husband pay for every lie. Chapter 4. The Performance. The next 3 weeks transformed Cynthia into someone she barely recognized in the mirror. A woman who cooked perfect dinners while calculating destruction, who smiled gently while planning war, who played the role of devoted wife so convincingly that even she almost believed the performance. Every evening she came home from her job at the non-profit, where she managed grant programs, to find Clyde sprawled on the couch, frustration rolling off him in waves. His business was bleeding money faster now, creditors calling daily, clients backing out of contracts, the walls closing in from every direction. "How was your day?" she would ask, setting grocery bags on the kitchen counter, already moving to start dinner. "Another nightmare," Clyde would mutter, not even looking up from his phone. "Lost the Henderson project. They went with someone cheaper, said our bids aren't competitive anymore. That was a $200,000 contract. Sin, I needed that money." She would make sympathetic noises, ask gentle questions, listen to his complaints with concerned eyes, while internally cataloguing every detail for Bernard's investigator. She learned that Clyde owed money to suppliers, contractors, even his business partner. The company was 3 months from total bankruptcy, maybe less if creditors started filing liens. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked one evening, setting his favorite meal in front of him. Pot roast with potatoes, the recipe from his mother that he always said made everything better. He barely glanced at it. "Unless you've got $2 million hidden somewhere, not really." She smiled softly, setting her own plate down. "If I did, you'd be the first to know." He squeezed her hand, and for just a second his expression flickered with something that might have been genuine affection. "I know I've been distant lately, work stress, but I appreciate you, babe. You're holding everything together while I'm falling apart." Cynthia wondered if he believed his own lies, if some part of his brain genuinely thought he was a devoted husband going through a difficult period, rather than a man actively planning to abandon his wife for someone younger. The nights were worst. He would go to bed early, claiming exhaustion, then text for hours under the covers. She would pretend to be asleep, her back to him, listening to the soft tap of his fingers on glass. Sometimes he would laugh quietly at something, and she would imagine what jokes he was sharing with the woman who called him baby with such casual intimacy. One Thursday evening, Clyde announced he had to visit a potential investor in another city overnight. "Big opportunity," he explained, already packing a bag. "This guy might invest enough to save the whole company. I'll be back tomorrow night." Cynthia helped him pack, folding shirts carefully, asking innocent questions about the investor's name and the meeting location. She kissed him goodbye at the door, waved as his truck pulled away, then immediately called Bernard's investigator. "Frank, he's traveling tonight. Can you confirm where he's actually going?" "I can have that information in 2 hours, Mrs. Rogers." The confirmation came 90 minutes later. Clyde was not meeting any investor. He was checked into a mid-range hotel downtown under his own name, and a woman matching the description of his mistress had been seen entering his room carrying an overnight bag. Cynthia hung up the phone and felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no hurt, just cold acknowledgement of information she already knew. She spent the evening in Clyde's home office, photographing every document with methodical precision. His construction company files told a story of catastrophic mismanagement and terrible luck. He owed $2.3 million to various creditors and suppliers. Equipment loans were 3 months behind. His business partner was circling like a vulture, offering buyout terms that were barely 20 cents on the dollar. Without a massive cash infusion immediately, the company would collapse by spring. She photographed contracts, loan documents, partnership agreements, supplier invoices, everything that painted the picture of a man drowning in debt with no lifeline visible anywhere on the horizon. Frank's investigator report arrived that night via encrypted email, and Cynthia read it on her laptop at the kitchen table, drinking wine and absorbing information about her husband's other life. The mistress was named Jolene, 28 years old, a dental hygienist Clyde had met 2 years ago when he supervised a kitchen renovation at her apartment pretty in a conventional way. Long blonde hair, active social media presence filled with inspirational quotes and workout selfies. She made $42,000 annually, drove a leased car, rented a one-bedroom apartment in a complex that advertised luxury living while offering paper-thin walls and coin-operated laundry. The report included dated photographs of Clyde and Jolene together, restaurants, hotels, walks through downtown parks, even a weekend trip last month when Clyde claimed he was meeting suppliers. Cynthia studied every image with surgical detachment. Her husband looked happy in these photos, genuinely happy in a way she hadn't seen him look in years. He smiled at Jolene the way he used to smile at Cynthia before life, and business stress and reality eroded whatever had once been real between them. She wondered if he loved Jolene, or if he just loved the escape she represented, a life without responsibilities, without a wife who knew him too well, without the weight of failure pressing down on everything. The final page of the investigator's report made Cynthia's breath catch, a jeweler's receipt from 3 weeks ago. Clyde had purchased a diamond bracelet for $4,000 on their joint credit card. She checked her own wrist, bare of any jewelry, except the simple watch her mother had given her for college graduation. That bracelet was not meant for her. Cynthia closed the laptop and sat in the silent kitchen, looking around at the house she had inherited from her grandmother, filled with furniture she and Clyde had picked out together, photos from a wedding that felt like it had happened to different people in a different lifetime. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. The next morning, she would open a new account under her maiden name at a different bank entirely. She would systematically transfer her personal funds, close their joint credit cards, and begin documenting every shared asset with the thoroughness of someone preparing for total war. Clyde came home the next evening, whistling, relaxed and cheerful in a way that made Cynthia want to throw something at his lying face. "The meeting went great," he announced, kissing her cheek. "Really promising. This investor might actually save everything." "That's wonderful," Cynthia replied, setting dinner on the table. "Tell me all about it." He spun elaborate lies over pot roast and potatoes, describing fictional conversations with fictional investors in vivid detail. She listened and smiled and asked interested questions, memorizing every word for Bernard's files. That night, while Clyde snored beside her, Cynthia stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman her mother had been. Quiet and careful, building an empire in absolute silence, trusting no one, protecting herself with walls that looked like humility but were actually fortress-grade steel. She understood now why her mother had lived so modestly despite impossible wealth. Why she had warned Cynthia about depending on anyone for security, why she had structured everything to remain hidden until the exact moment Cynthia needed it most. Her mother had known this day would come, had prepared for it, had built Cynthia an arsenal and left instructions with Bernard Wallace to help her use it. "I won't waste what you gave me," Cynthia whispered to the darkness. "I promise." Beside her, Clyde shifted in his sleep, muttering something incoherent. She turned to look at him, this man she had loved, trusted, built a life with, and felt nothing but cold determination. Let him think she was weak. Let him think she was naive. Let him underestimate her completely. He had no idea who he was actually dealing with, and by the time he figured it out, it would be far too late to save himself. Chapter 5. The Crossroads. Bernard's call came on a Tuesday morning 4 weeks after the funeral, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone delivering news that would change everything. "Mrs. Rogers, we need to meet today. Things are accelerating faster than anticipated." Cynthia sat in her car outside the non-profit office where she still maintained her perfectly normal life, phone pressed to her ear, watching colleagues enter the building with coffee cups and Monday complaints. How fast? Clyde's largest creditor is threatening legal action within 30 days, and there's a development with his business partner that changes the timeline considerably. "Can you come to my office at noon?" She rearranged her schedule, citing a family legal matter no one questioned because she was still the recently bereaved woman whose mother had just died. People were kind, sympathetic, telling her to take whatever time she needed. Bernard's office felt different in daylight, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of a city that looked deceptively peaceful from 42 stories above the chaos of street-level traffic. He had documents spread across his mahogany desk like battle plans, and Frank the investigator sat in the corner, looking even more rumpled than usual. Hoffman Materials Supply is demanding immediate payment of $180,000, Bernard began without preamble. They've retained counsel and will file a mechanics lien against Clyde's business assets next month if he doesn't pay, that will trigger default clauses in his other loans, causing a cascading collapse of the entire company. How long does he have? 30 days, maybe less. Cynthia absorbed this information, her mind calculating timelines and strategic opportunities. "You said something about his business partner?" Frank spoke up, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes. "Ramon Ortiz has been quietly trying to position himself to acquire Clyde's share of the company. He's been talking to suppliers, clients, even some of Clyde's employees. Everyone knows the business is circling the drain, and Ramon's positioning himself as the savior who'll step in and rescue everything once Clyde's forced out." "What's his offer?" $175,000 for Clyde's entire stake. The company's assets and client contracts are worth at least 10 times that amount under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances. Ramon's offering barely enough to cover Clyde's personal debts and legal fees, leaving him with nothing. Bernard leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mrs. Rogers, we're approaching a decision point. The company could be saved with a $1.5 million capital injection, enough to pay off creditors, replace aging equipment, and cover operating expenses while they rebuild. You have the resources to write that check today." He paused, letting that sink in. "You could save everything. Demand couples therapy as a condition of the investment, require complete financial transparency and involvement in business decisions. Force him into a position where he either has to confess his affair or end it. You could fight for your marriage if you wanted to. Some people do." Cynthia stood and walked to the windows, looking down at tiny cars moving along streets like blood cells through arteries. Somewhere in that city, Clyde was pretending to work while probably texting Jolene, planning a future where he'd be free of the anchor weighing him down. She thought about the 23-year-old woman who had married him 9 years ago in a garden wedding with too many flowers and not enough friends who actually knew them well. She'd been so certain then, so stupidly confident that love conquered all, that their partnership would weather anything life threw at them. That woman felt like a stranger now, naive, trusting, dangerously unprepared for the reality that people changed, that love was sometimes just performance, that the man who promised forever could look you straight in the eyes and lie with such perfect conviction that you never saw the betrayal coming. She remembered his laugh in the background when that woman answered his phone. The text messages calling her mother the old hag 3 days before the funeral. His elaborate lies about chest pains while she buried the only parent who had never abandoned her. "Let it burn," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent office. "Let everything he built turn to ashes. Then I want to buy those ashes for pennies on the dollar." Bernard smiled, the expression of someone who had just been given permission to do what he did best. "Then here's what we're going to do." They spent the next hour planning a strategy that was both elegant and ruthlessly effective. Bernard would create an anonymous LLC called Milestone Holdings, structured through multiple corporate layers that made ownership impossible to trace. When Clyde's company finally collapsed, Milestone would acquire the valuable assets and client contracts through the bankruptcy process. "It'll look like a third-party vulture swooping in to pick at the corpse," Frank explained. "No one will connect it to you. Clyde will think some random investment firm bought his life's work for nothing, never knowing his wife owns every piece." "What about Ramon?" Cynthia asked. "Let him think he's getting the deal of the century right up until he's outbid at the last possible moment. The look on his face will be worth the legal fees alone." They were finalizing details when Bernard's assistant knocked softly. "Mr. Wallace, Mrs. Rogers has a 4 o'clock commitment. The charity board meeting?" Cynthia had completely forgotten. Her mother had sat on the board of the Women's Education Foundation for 15 years, and they'd asked Cynthia to take her mother's place, at least temporarily. She'd agreed because saying no felt wrong so soon after the funeral, but she'd been dreading the meeting, rooms full of wealthy women who would look at her with pity and make polite conversation, while clearly wondering if she was qualified to fill her mother's shoes. "I should go," she said reluctantly, already gathering her bag. "One more thing," Bernard said, his tone shifting slightly. "Your mother sat on 6 different charity boards and held leadership positions in 3 community organizations. They're all reaching out, asking if you'll consider taking her places. You don't have to say yes to all of them, or even most of them. But these positions come with influence, connections, and insight into how wealth actually moves through this city. That information will be valuable as we move forward." Cynthia nodded, understanding the implication. Her mother hadn't just built financial wealth, she'd built social capital, networks, relationships that opened doors and provided intelligence. Now those resources were available to Cynthia if she was willing to step into her mother's world completely. The charity luncheon was held at an upscale hotel with crystal chandeliers and wait staff who moved like ghosts. 20 women sat around a table discussing fundraising strategies for providing scholarships to first-generation college students. Cynthia tried to focus, taking notes, contributing occasionally, playing the role of grieving daughter, respectfully continuing her mother's work. During a break, a man approached her. Tall, late 40s or early 50s, salt and pepper hair, expensive but understated suit, eyes that looked like they'd seen grief and survived it. "Mrs. Rogers? I'm Burt Reynolds. I represented my late wife's literacy foundation, and I wanted to express my condolences about your mother. I met her a few times at joint foundation events, and she was remarkably impressive." Cynthia shook his hand, appreciating that he didn't hold it too long or look at her with the excessive sympathy that made her want to escape these events entirely. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say." "I mean it genuinely. Your mother had this quality of listening completely when someone spoke to her, like they were the only person in the room. That's rare, especially in these circles where everyone's usually calculating their next connection." Despite herself, Cynthia smiled. That's exactly what she was like. She'd ask questions that actually mattered and remember your answers months later. They talked for 15 minutes about their mothers. His had passed away when he was young, raising himself and 3 siblings after their father disappeared. He asked intelligent questions about her mother's work, listened without interrupting, and treated Cynthia like a person rather than a tragedy to be handled delicately. As the meeting resumed, he said something that stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. "Mrs. Rogers, I knew your mother slightly through this work. She was formidable, brilliant, and didn't suffer fools. Something tells me the apple didn't fall far from that particular tree." It was the first time in weeks that someone had looked at Cynthia and seen her, not Clyde's struggling wife, not a grieving daughter, not someone to be pitied, but a person of substance in her own right. She drove home feeling something she couldn't quite name, a strange lightness mixed with possibility. When she pulled into the driveway, Clyde's truck was already there, parked at an angle that suggested he'd been drinking. She found him in the living room, surrounded by paperwork, head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, his face drawn with exhaustion and defeat. "It's over, Sin. Ramon's offer is the best I'm going to get. I'm signing the papers tomorrow. She set her purse down carefully, her mind racing through calculations about timelines and strategy. Are you sure that's the right move? I don't have a choice. The creditors are circling, and if I don't sell to Ramon, they'll tear apart the company and I'll get nothing. At least this way I can pay off my personal debts and walk away clean. Clean. He actually said clean, like he wasn't planning to immediately file for divorce and walk away from 9 years of marriage with nothing but debt and betrayal in his wake. If that's what you think is best, Cynthia said quietly. He looked at her with something that might have been gratitude or guilt. Thanks for understanding. I know this hasn't been easy on you either. She almost laughed at the understatement, but caught herself in time. Instead, she moved to the kitchen and started preparing dinner, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables and thought about Bert's comment. The apple didn't fall far from that particular tree. Her mother had built an empire in silence, had survived abandonment and heartbreak, had raised a daughter alone while accumulating wealth that would make most people dizzy. Cynthia was that woman's daughter. She had inherited more than money. She'd inherited survival instincts, strategic thinking, and the absolute refusal to let anyone make her small. Clyde thought he was getting away clean. Ramon thought he was getting a deal. Jolene probably thought she was getting a successful man. All of them were wrong, and they wouldn't realize their mistake until it was far too late to undo the damage. Cynthia smiled as she stirred pasta sauce, planning moves they couldn't see coming, becoming the woman her mother had always known she could be when pushed hard enough to stop being kind and start being ruthless instead. Chapter 6. The Collapse. Clyde's world didn't implode all at once. It crumbled in stages, each piece of his life falling away like stones from a deteriorating foundation, and Cynthia watched every moment with the detached fascination of someone observing a natural disaster from safe distance. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday morning when his largest remaining client, Henderson Development, cancelled a $400,000 contract via email so cold and corporate it might have been generated by algorithm. Due to ongoing concerns about timeline delays and quality inconsistencies, we've decided to pursue other options for our upcoming projects. We appreciate your past work, but feel this decision is in our best interest moving forward. Clyde read the email 3 times at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold in his hand, his face draining of color until he looked physically ill. They were my biggest account. I needed this contract to survive the next 6 months. Cynthia looked up from her own laptop, where she was reviewing Bernard's latest update on the Milestone Holdings LLC formation. Can you find out what happened? Maybe there's a way to fix whatever concerns they had. It's too late. They've already signed with someone else. He threw his phone across the room, watching it bounce off the couch cushions. This is Ramon. I know it's him. He's been poisoning my relationships, turning clients against me, positioning himself to swoop in and take everything I built. He wasn't entirely wrong, though he had no idea how much worse the situation actually was. Ramon had been making moves, but so had Cynthia through Bernard's network of contacts. A word here, a concern raised there, strategic information about Clyde's financial troubles shared with decision-makers who valued stability over loyalty. The second blow came from Hoffman Materials Supply, whose attorney sent a formal demand letter that arrived via certified mail. Clyde opened it standing at the mailbox, reading the legal language that translated to, "Pay us $180,000 within 14 days, or we will file liens against every business asset you own and force you into bankruptcy court." He came inside looking like someone had punched him in the stomach, the letter crumpled in his white-knuckled fist. "I don't have that kind of money. I can barely make payroll this month." "What about Ramon's offer?" "He dropped it to $150,000 this morning, said the business is worth less now that Henderson cancelled. He knows I'm desperate, and he's bleeding me dry." Cynthia made sympathetic noises while internally calculating how perfectly the timeline was falling into place. Ramon thought he was orchestrating Clyde's downfall, positioning himself to acquire the company for pennies. He had no idea he was about to be outmaneuvered by an anonymous LLC that would bid higher at the last possible moment, leaving him with nothing but wasted time and legal fees. The evenings became unbearable to witness. Clyde would come home night after night defeated and drinking heavily, raging against incompetent employees who had actually quit because he hadn't paid them in 6 weeks. Disloyal clients who had legitimate concerns about his ability to finish projects, suppliers who unreasonably expected payment for materials they'd delivered months ago. He never once looked in the mirror and acknowledged his own role in the collapse. Never admitted that his affair had distracted him from business for months, never took responsibility for the financial mismanagement that had started long before his current crisis. Instead, he drank bourbon and blamed the universe for his problems, while Cynthia sat across from him playing the supportive wife who wished she could help but had no resources to offer. "Did your mother really leave nothing?" he asked one evening, his words slightly slurred, desperation naked in his voice. "No life insurance, no hidden accounts, nothing that could help us?" Cynthia looked him straight in the eyes and lied with perfect composure, her voice soft with fabricated regret. "Some personal items, photographs, her old car, a few thousand in a savings account that went entirely to funeral expenses and outstanding medical bills. You know she lived simply, Clyde. She was comfortable, but not wealthy." He believed her without question, too self-absorbed and panicked to notice that his wife had stopped wearing her wedding ring to work, had opened separate bank accounts, had begun systematically photographing every shared asset and documenting every debt in his name alone. Too desperate to see that the woman sitting across from him had transformed into someone completely different, harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous than the trusting young woman he'd married 9 years ago. That weekend, while Clyde was supposedly working late, actually at Jolene's apartment based on the location data Frank was monitoring, Cynthia attended a gallery opening featuring emerging artists whose work benefited homeless youth programs she'd been invited through her mother's foundation connections. Another door opening in the world she was learning to navigate. The gallery was downtown in a converted warehouse with exposed brick and industrial lighting that made everything look simultaneously raw and expensive. Art hung on white walls, while people in designer clothes drank wine from actual glasses and discussed technique and meaning with the practiced ease of those who attended these events regularly. Cynthia felt out of place until she saw Bert standing in front of a massive abstract painting, his head tilted slightly, genuinely studying the brushwork rather than performing appreciation for an audience. She approached slowly, standing beside him to view the painting, swirls of blue and grey that somehow captured the feeling of drowning and fighting towards surface simultaneously, devastating and hopeful at the same time, Bert observed without looking at her. "That's a difficult balance to achieve." "Like life," Cynthia replied. He turned then, recognition and genuine pleasure crossing his face. "Mrs. Rogers, I was hoping you might be here tonight. Are you involved with this organization?" "My mother was. I'm trying to step into some of the spaces she left behind, though I'm not sure I'm qualified." "If you're anything like your mother, you're more than qualified." He gestured toward the painting. "Are you enjoying the work?" They talked for nearly 2 hours, moving through the gallery while discussing art and loss and purpose and what it meant to rebuild life after devastating grief. Bert spoke openly about his late wife, Anne, the brutal final months of her illness, and his struggle to find meaning again after she passed 3 years ago. "I spent the first year angry," he admitted, standing in front of a sculpture made from reclaimed metal. Angry at her for dying, angry at myself for not being able to save her, angry at the universe for being so cosmically unfair. Then I spent the second year numb, just going through motions. This third year is when I finally started feeling things again. Joy, purpose, hope. It's terrifying, honestly. Caring about things again means risking that kind of pain again." Cynthia understood completely. How do you trust anything after watching someone you love deteriorate? How do you believe in permanence when you've learned how quickly everything can disappear? "I don't know if you ever fully trust again the way you did before," Bert said thoughtfully, "but I think maybe that's okay. Maybe loving with full knowledge of how badly it can hurt is actually braver than loving with naive certainty that nothing bad could happen. He didn't ask intrusive questions about Cynthia's marriage, didn't pry into why she sometimes looked sad when she thought no one was watching, didn't push for information she wasn't ready to share. But there was a connection, neither acknowledged aloud, a recognition of shared pain and resilience, an understanding that some experiences changed you fundamentally, and you either broke completely or became something stronger in the fractured places. When the gallery event ended and people began drifting toward the exit, Bert asked casually if she'd like to meet for coffee sometime. "As friends," he added quickly, reading something in her expression. "I've been told I'm a decent listener, and I get the sense you might have some complicated situations to navigate." Cynthia surprised herself by saying yes immediately, without the careful calculation she'd applied to everything else in her life lately. "Friends sounds perfect. I could use a friend right now." They exchanged phone numbers, and as she drove home through the late evening traffic, Cynthia felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a genuine smile that had nothing to do with strategic planning or calculated revenge. She pulled into the driveway just after midnight to find Clyde passed out drunk on the living room couch, surrounded by paperwork that he'd been too intoxicated to hide divorce papers, she realized, reading the header on the document closest to his slack hand. She gathered the scattered pages carefully, reading every word with clinical precision, while her husband snored and muttered incomprehensibly beside her. He was planning to file in approximately 6 weeks, immediately after finalizing the sale of his remaining business shares to Ramon. The papers outlined his demands: keep the house, which he clearly didn't realize was in her name alone through her grandmother's inheritance, split all marital assets 50-50, and no spousal support because the marriage had been irreparably damaged for over a year prior to separation. He thought he'd walk away clean and start fresh with Jolene, thought he'd time everything perfectly, selling his business to cover his debts, filing for divorce while Cynthia was still supposedly grieving and vulnerable, escaping before she had time to mount any kind of legal defense. He'd calculated everything except the one variable that mattered. His wife was 3 steps ahead of him, wealthier than he could imagine, and absolutely committed to making him pay for every single lie. Cynthia photographed the divorce papers with her phone, then carefully returned them to their scattered positions around his unconscious body. She covered him with a blanket, turned off the lamp, and went upstairs to bed. She lay in the darkness thinking about Bert's comment about loving bravely, despite knowing how badly it could hurt, thinking about her mother building an empire in silence, thinking about the woman she was becoming, someone who could plan destruction with the same hands that had once believed in forever. Clyde had made his choices. Now he would live with the consequences of underestimating the woman who had loved him, supported him, and watched him throw it all away for a 28-year-old dental hygienist and the fantasy of a life unburdened by reality. She closed her eyes and slept peacefully, dreamlessly, like someone who had finally stopped questioning their own strength and started trusting it completely. Chapter 7. The Separation. Cynthia stopped pretending entirely on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the funeral, when winter had fully settled into bare trees and grey skies that pressed down like concrete overhead. She found Clyde in the kitchen making coffee, his movements sluggish with hangover, his face showing every one of his 34 years plus several he hadn't yet lived. He looked up when she entered, guilt and exhaustion fighting for dominance in his bloodshot eyes. "We need to talk," Cynthia said, her voice calm and steady as flatland. The coffee mug paused halfway to his mouth, every muscle in his body tensed immediately, the guilty reflex of someone who knew their secrets were catching up but wasn't sure which one had finally surfaced. "Okay," he managed, setting the mug down carefully like it might explode. Cynthia sat across from him at the kitchen table they'd bought together 4 years ago at a furniture store going out of business, back when they'd still made plans and used words like "we" and "our future" without irony or sadness. "I want a legal separation," she stated simply, watching his face process the words. Not divorce yet, just separation. We need space to figure out who we are without the constant stress of trying to save something that might not want to be saved. The relief that flooded his features was immediate, visible, and absolutely insulting. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched. His entire body language shifted from defensive panic to barely concealed celebration. "Yeah," he said, trying to sound reluctant, but failing completely. "Yeah, maybe that's smart. Give us both some breathing room, some perspective, no pressure to make huge decisions while everything's so chaotic." Translation: perfect timing for him. Separation meant freedom without the complications of divorce proceedings, while his business collapsed meant he could see Jolene openly without technically cheating on his wife, meant he could position himself to file for divorce on his timeline when he was ready, without Cynthia having any control over the narrative. "I'll move out temporarily," Cynthia continued, her voice steady despite the fury burning cold in her chest. "Maybe get an apartment downtown, closer to work. We can take time to really think about what we want our lives to look like." "That's probably good," Clyde agreed, already mentally calculating his freedom. "Take whatever time you need. No pressure at all. We've been together since we were kids, basically. Maybe we just grew apart, you know. It happens. It happens. Like their marriage was weather. Something that occurred randomly rather than something he'd actively destroyed through lies and betrayal and cruel text messages about her dying mother. "I'll talk to an attorney about legal separation paperwork," Cynthia said, "just to protect us both financially while we're apart. Make sure neither of us is liable for debts the other incurs, that kind of thing." Clyde nodded enthusiastically, seeing only protection from her discovering his business debts, not realizing she already knew every creditor, every dollar, every desperate scheme that had failed to save him. "That's smart. Really mature of you, Sin. This is why we work well together. We can handle hard stuff like adults." She almost laughed at the absurdity, but caught herself in time. Instead, she stood, retrieved her coffee, and left him sitting at the table, already reaching for his phone to text Jolene the good news that his wife was leaving. By the end of the week, Cynthia had moved into a luxury apartment downtown that occupied the entire top floor of a converted historic building. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the river. Hardwood floors gleamed under modern lighting. The kitchen had appliances she didn't know how to use and counter space that could accommodate cooking for 20 people. Clyde never asked how she afforded it on her non-profit salary, never questioned where the furniture came from or how she'd secured a lease so quickly. He was too relieved by her absence, too focused on his own imploding life, too stupid to see the wealth appearing around his wife like magic. Bernard had arranged everything through one of her inherited properties. She was essentially her own landlord, paying rent to herself through corporate structures so complex they'd require forensic accounting to unravel. The apartment was hers, along with the entire building and 6 others on the same block. She filed for legal separation through Bernard, not divorce yet. The strategic move protected her assets completely while leaving Clyde vulnerable to his creditors, without any claim on her resources. "He won't understand the difference until it's too late," Bernard explained over coffee in her new apartment. "Legal separation looks like you're being cautious and fair. Actually, it's fortress walls going up around everything you own, while he stands outside wondering why he feels cold." Her coffee meetings with Bert became weekly, then twice weekly, evolving naturally from acquaintance to genuine friendship. They met at different cafes around the city, sometimes talking for hours about everything except the obvious attraction building between them like electrical charge. Bert was careful, respectful, never pushing boundaries or asking questions Cynthia wasn't ready to answer. He talked about Anne with the comfortable grief of someone who had processed loss and emerged intact on the other side. 20 years of marriage, partnership through medical school, and building his venture capital firm, watching her deteriorate through 18 months of aggressive treatment that bought time but couldn't buy survival. The worst part wasn't watching her die, he admitted one afternoon in a cafe where rain streaked the windows and turned the world outside into watercolor blurs. "It was the relief I felt when it finally ended. I loved her completely, and I was relieved she was gone because it meant the suffering stopped. That guilt almost destroyed me. Cynthia understood that particular shade of complicated emotion. When my mother finally passed, part of me felt freed. Not happy, freed, like I could finally exhale after holding my breath for months. Then I felt horrible for feeling freed, like it made me a terrible daughter. It makes you human, Bert said gently. Grief and relief can coexist. Love and exhaustion aren't opposites. She told him about her mother, the lonely funeral, the growing distance in her marriage over the past 2 years. She didn't mention Clyde's affair yet. It still felt too raw, too humiliating to speak aloud to someone whose respect she was beginning to value deeply. Meanwhile, Bernard's anonymous LLC moved through the corporate formation process with bureaucratic precision. Milestone Holdings now existed on paper, properly registered, completely opaque regarding ownership. When Clyde's company entered bankruptcy proceedings, which happened the day Hoffman Materials filed their lien and triggered default clauses throughout his loan structure, Milestone was positioned to bid on assets. The bankruptcy auction occurred on a Wednesday morning in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and desperation. Clyde sat beside his chief attorney Lloyd Briggs, looking diminished and defeated in a suit that no longer fit properly after he'd lost weight from stress and skipped meals Ramon attended with his attorney, smug confidence radiating from every pore. He expected token resistance, maybe one other bidder, then victory. The auctioneer began at $50,000 for the entire asset package: equipment, client contracts, intellectual property, business name, and goodwill. Ramon bid $75,000, barely suppressing his smile. Then a voice from the back, $180,000. Everyone turned. A woman in her 30s, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase, approached the table. Milestone Holdings, LLC. We're prepared to close immediately with certified funds. Ramon's face went purple. $190,000. $210,000. The Milestone representative countered without hesitation. $215,000. $250,000 final offer. Take it or leave it. The auctioneer looked to Ramon, whose attorney was frantically whispering calculations about whether fighting was worthwhile. Ramon shook his head slowly, the realization settling in his features that he'd been outmaneuvered completely. Sold to Milestone Holdings for $250,000. Clyde looked shell-shocked, unable to process that some random investment firm had just bought his entire life's work for barely 10 cents on the dollar of its actual value. The money would cover his immediate debts and legal fees, with almost nothing remaining. He'd lost everything he'd built, and he had no idea his wife owned every single piece. 2 months passed in a strange limbo period where Cynthia existed in 2 separate worlds simultaneously. During the day, she worked at the non-profit and attended her mother's former board meetings, stepping into leadership roles and learning how wealth and influence moved through the city's social infrastructure. Evenings, she met Bert for coffee or dinner, always public, always appropriate, their friendship deepening in ways that felt both natural and terrifying. "I need to tell you something," she said one evening over Italian food, in a restaurant where candlelight made everyone look softer and more honest than daylight allowed, "about my marriage." Bert set down his wineglass, his attention complete. "Only if you want to." She told him everything: the phone call at the funeral, the affair, the calculated revenge, the hidden inheritance, the way she'd systematically dismantled Clyde's life while he thought he was abandoning her. She spoke quietly, methodically, watching Bert's face for judgment or shock or disgust. Instead, he listened without interruption until she finished. Then he was quiet for a long moment, processing. "How do you feel about what you did?" he asked finally. "I don't regret it," Cynthia admitted. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you someone who refused to be a victim. There's a difference between revenge and justice, and sometimes the line between them is just timing and perspective." He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "Can I ask you something? What do you want now? Not what you're fighting against. What are you moving toward?" The question caught her completely off guard. She'd been so focused on destroying Clyde, on strategic planning and calculated moves, that she hadn't thought about what came after the war ended. "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm not sure who I am without anger driving everything." "Maybe that's what you figure out next," Bert suggested gently. "The person you want to become now that you're free." That conversation shifted something fundamental between them. A week later, Clyde showed up at the house, which he still somehow thought of as partially his, despite the deed being solely in Cynthia's name, to collect more belongings. He looked lighter, happier, the weight of failure somehow transforming into relief now that the worst had happened and he could stop pretending. "Hey, Cyn, you got a minute?" She let him in, watching him move through rooms that no longer felt like his space, gathering items that revealed his plans, camping equipment, his good watch, clothes for warm weather. "I've been thinking," he started, his tone carefully casual. "Maybe we should just make this permanent. Quick, clean divorce. We can both move on with our lives, no hard feelings." No hard feelings. Like 9 years of marriage and his devastating betrayal were just a minor inconvenience they could politely move past. "Have your attorney contact Bernard Wallace," Cynthia replied, her voice neutral. "We'll work something out." Clyde left whistling, practically glowing with anticipation of his fresh start with Jolene, his freedom from the anchor wife, his chance to rebuild without the weight of his failures dragging him down. He had no idea he'd just triggered his own execution, that his wife had been waiting for exactly this moment. That the divorce he thought would liberate him was actually the door closing on any possibility of escape from the consequences he'd earned. Cynthia watched his truck disappear down the street, then called Bernard. "He's ready. Let's show him what he actually lost." Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Divorce proceedings officially began on a Monday morning when frost still clung to grass and car windshields reflected pale sunlight like mirrors scattered across the suburban landscape. Clyde expected a quick, amicable split with minimal assets to divide and maybe some mild negotiation about retirement accounts that barely existed anyway. He'd hired Lloyd Briggs because he was cheap and local, a solo practitioner operating from a strip mall office who handled divorces between DUI defenses and small claims cases. Lloyd called on Wednesday with news that shattered Clyde's comfortable expectations like a sledgehammer through plate glass. "We have a problem," Lloyd began, his voice carrying the nervous quality of someone who'd just realized their simple case had become catastrophically complicated. "Her attorney filed the response to your petition, and there are some serious issues we need to discuss immediately. Can you come to my office today?" Clyde arrived in jeans and a wrinkled polo shirt, looking like someone who'd been doing manual labor for Ramon at a fraction of his former salary. Lloyd's office smelled like old coffee and legal paperwork, walls decorated with law school diplomas from institutions no one had heard of, and motivational posters about justice and perseverance. "What's the problem?" Clyde demanded, sitting in a chair that squeaked every time he moved. "She agreed to divorce. We're separated. This should be straightforward." Lloyd spread documents across his cluttered desk like evidence in a murder trial. "Your wife is demanding the house, half of any remaining business assets, and $500,000 in lump sum spousal support. And there are properties and LLC holdings listed in the disclosure documents that I've never seen before. In any of your financial paperwork, I need you to explain these assets." Clyde stared at the papers like they were written in foreign language. "What properties? What LLCs? I don't have anything. The business is gone. I'm working for Ramon, making barely enough to cover my apartment rent. There are no assets to split." "According to these filings, your wife has significant assets," Lloyd continued, his expression growing more concerned with every word. "Commercial real estate holdings, investment accounts, business interests in multiple limited liability companies. We need to understand the source of these assets, and whether any of this is marital property subject to division." The color drained from Clyde's face as his brain struggled to process information that made no sense whatsoever. "That's impossible. Cynthia works for a non-profit. She makes maybe $50,000 a year. She drives a 10-year-old car. Her mother died broke, except for funeral expenses. Where the hell would she get commercial real estate?" That's what we need to find out. And we need to understand why she's claiming $500,000 in spousal support when you have no ability to pay anything close to that amount. This is insane. There's been some mistake. She doesn't have money. She can't have money. I would know. But even as he said it, doubt began creeping into Clyde's consciousness like cold water seeping through cracks, the way Cynthia had moved out so quickly, the downtown apartment he'd glimpsed once when picking up documents. Expensive, modern, nothing she could afford on her salary. The calm confidence in her voice when she'd agreed to divorce, no tears or begging or fighting to save their marriage. The phone call at the funeral crashed back into his memory with sudden, horrifying clarity, the woman answering his phone, his laugh in the background. The way Cynthia had looked at him afterward, cold, distant, calculating. "I need to talk to her," Clyde said, standing abruptly, face to face. "There's been some massive misunderstanding and we need to clear this up before lawyers make everything worse." Lloyd looked skeptical but arranged a meeting at Bernard Wallace's firm, Neutral Territory, with attorneys present. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Clyde 6 days to spiral through increasingly panicked speculation about what was actually happening. Tuesday arrived with the inevitability of Judgment Day. Clyde drove downtown in his aging truck, parking in a garage that charged more per hour than he'd made in a full day of work. Bernard Wallace's office building stretched toward grey skies like a monument to wealth and power, all glass and steel and architectural intimidation. The reception area on the 42nd floor looked like money itself had been converted into furniture and artwork. Lloyd arrived moments after Clyde, sweating despite the perfect climate control, his cheap briefcase looking pathetic next to the designer handbags visible through glass-walled conference rooms. They were shown to a conference room with views of the entire city, spreading out below like a kingdom observed from castle walls. Clyde sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than his monthly rent and waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Bernard entered first, silver-haired and imposing in a charcoal suit, tailored so precisely it looked like armor. Then Cynthia walked in, and Clyde actually gasped. She wore a navy suit that fit like couture, her hair professionally styled, makeup subtle but flawless, radiating quiet power that made her look like someone he'd never met before. She moved with confidence that seemed impossible for the woman who'd cooked his dinners and supported his failing business and cried at her mother's funeral. This woman looked like she owned buildings and companies and possibly entire city blocks. This woman looked dangerous. She sat across from him without smiling, without acknowledging him as anything more than an opposing party in a legal proceeding. Bernard settled beside her, opening a portfolio with movements that suggested this was routine, unremarkable, just another day protecting wealthy clients from people who'd underestimated them. "Let's begin," Bernard said, his voice professionally neutral. "Mrs. Rogers is prepared to make a fair and final settlement offer that will resolve all outstanding issues efficiently." He presented terms methodically, each word falling like a hammer blow against Clyde's understanding of reality. Cynthia would retain all inherited assets, the full extent of which had not been disclosed in detail for privacy reasons. She would keep the house, which had always been in her name alone through her grandmother's inheritance. She requested $500,000 in settlement for 9 years of supporting Clyde's failing business dreams with her salary, emotional labor, and family resources. In exchange, she would release him from ongoing spousal support and ensure his name was cleared from any involvement in her mother's estate settlement. "What estate?" Clyde finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "What the hell are you talking about? Her mother had nothing." Cynthia spoke for the first time, her voice ice-cold and perfectly controlled. "My mother left me a $300 million commercial real estate portfolio that she built over 40 years of careful investment and absolute discretion." The words hung in the air like suspended animation. Clyde's brain refused to process them, kept hitting the number, 300 million, like a computer caught in an infinite loop. "The inheritance I called to tell you about," Cynthia continued, her eyes locked on his face, watching him decompose in real time, while I stood at her gravesite after burying her alone. Understanding crashed over Clyde like a building collapsing. The phone call. The woman answering, his laugh in the background, Cynthia hearing everything while he was with Jolene celebrating being free of his obligations. That phone call. You knew, this whole time. His voice cracked completely. Cynthia leaned forward slightly, and her expression could have frozen fire. No, Clyde, you knew. You knew you were choosing her over me while I buried my mother alone. You knew you were planning to leave me the second it became convenient. You knew you were calling me the anchor in your pathetic text messages to your mistress. She slid a folder across the polished table, and Clyde recognized his own words printed on paper. Months of messages, explicit photos, cruel jokes about his wife, plans for his future that involved abandoning her at her lowest moment. I just chose first, Cynthia finished quietly. Lloyd Briggs shakily asked about Dean and Associates' construction assets that had been liquidated in bankruptcy. Bernard slid another document across the table with practiced efficiency. My client's investment firm, Milestone Holdings, acquired those assets through a competitive sealed bid bankruptcy auction, all completely legal and properly documented through court proceedings. She's willing to sign those contracts and client relationships back to Mr. Dean for $2.3 million, the exact amount he currently owes to various creditors. Clyde couldn't breathe. The room spun like he was drunk, except he'd never been more painfully sober in his entire life. Every decision he'd made over the past year suddenly recontextualized itself into a pattern of catastrophic stupidity. His business, gone. His marriage, destroyed. His future with Jolene, built on sand because he was now broke and would be paying off debt for the next decade. The comfortable life he'd taken for granted vanished completely because he'd been too stupid and selfish to recognize what he actually had. He'd lost everything. Worse, he'd lost everything to the woman he'd underestimated and betrayed, who'd been 3 steps ahead the entire time, who'd watched him destroy himself while quietly building fortress walls around everything he'd ever wanted. Cynthia stood to leave, gathering her handbag with movements that suggested this meeting was mildly tedious, but ultimately unimportant. Sign the papers, Clyde. It's the best deal you're going to get. Sin, wait. His voice broke. Please, can we just talk, alone, without lawyers? She looked at him for a long moment, and he searched desperately for any sign of the woman who'd loved him, who'd believed in him, who'd stood beside him through every failure and setback. He found nothing. The woman looking back at him was a stranger who'd learned brutal lessons about trust and consequences and power. We have nothing to discuss, she said simply. Then she walked out without looking back, her heels clicking against marble floors with the sound of finality and absolute victory. Clyde sat in ruins across from 2 attorneys, his cheap lawyer looking shell-shocked, and Bernard Wallace already packing his portfolio like this had been routine paperwork, rather than the complete destruction of a man's entire life. I'd advise your client to accept these terms, Bernard said to Lloyd with professional courtesy. They're significantly more generous than what a court would likely award. Mrs. Rogers could pursue punitive damages for emotional distress, fraud, and several other claims that would leave your client in substantially worse circumstances. This settlement is mercy, not negotiation. Lloyd nodded numbly, unable to formulate any counter-argument to the truth sitting in front of them like undeniable evidence. Clyde put his head in his hands and realized with absolute clarity that he'd just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Never underestimate a quiet woman who loved you, because when she stops loving you, she'll be the most dangerous adversary you've ever faced. And he'd lost, before he even knew the war had started. Chapter 9. The Building One. Full year after standing beside her mother's grave with dirt clinging to her black dress, Cynthia Rogers stood inside the gutted shell of the historic Riverside building and finally understood what her mother had been preparing her for all along. The divorce had finalized 8 months earlier, after Clyde signed every document Bernard placed in front of him, his hand shaking with defeat and dawning comprehension of exactly how completely he'd destroyed his own life. He'd walked away with nothing but the clothes in his apartment and debt that would follow him for years, working construction for Ramon at $55,000 annually, barely half what he'd earned as owner, watching his ex-wife's success from a distance he couldn't bridge. Jolene had left him after 6 months when the reality of his financial situation became impossible to ignore. The handsome contractor with big dreams had transformed into a bitter man working manual labor and drinking away paychecks at bars where nobody knew his name. She'd moved on to a dentist who owned his practice and drove a car manufactured within the current decade, updating her social media with inspirational quotes about knowing your worth and never settling. Cynthia had watched it all unfold with the detached interest of someone observing consequences play out exactly as predicted, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, just the cold acknowledgement that actions carried weight and people revealed themselves when circumstances stripped away their comfortable masks. But the past 8 months had been about building rather than destroying, and that transformation had been infinitely more complicated than revenge. Her friendship with Bert had evolved slowly, carefully, like something fragile being constructed with shaking hands in the aftermath of earthquakes. 3 months into their coffee meetings, Bert had finally asked her to dinner, an actual date, not just casual friendship. His intentions clear and terrifyingly honest, Cynthia had said yes immediately, then cancelled the morning of, with a text message so cowardly she'd been ashamed. "I'm sorry, I can't do this, it's too soon." Bert had responded simply, "I understand. Take care of yourself." She'd cancelled again 2 weeks later when he'd tried a second time, her fear of trusting anyone romantically overwhelming every rational thought about this kind, patient man who'd never been anything but honest with her. That time, Bert hadn't responded immediately. 3 weeks of silence followed, and Cynthia realized with growing panic that she'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it, had let Clyde's betrayal poison something that could have been good and real. She'd finally called him late one evening, her voice shaking. "Bert, I'm sorry. I owe you an explanation and probably an apology." "You don't owe me anything," he'd replied, his tone careful. "But I'd like to understand what's happening, if you're willing to talk." They'd met for coffee, always safe, and Cynthia had told him the truth that felt like exposing a wound. "I watched my mother raise me alone after my father abandoned us when I was 4. She never remarried, never even dated that I knew of, because trusting someone that completely once and having them leave destroyed something fundamental in her. Then I watched my husband betray me at literally the worst moment of my life. I don't know how to believe in this, Bert. I don't know how to trust that you won't become those men." Bert had finished gently. "Cynthia, I'm not your father or your ex-husband, but I also can't spend years proving that while you keep one foot permanently out the door, waiting for me to inevitably disappoint you." His voice had carried frustration mixed with sadness. "I care about you deeply, more than is probably wise given how short a time we've known each other. But I need to know if you're actually interested in building something real, or if you're just practicing being okay again, using me as a safe prop who doesn't really matter." The words had landed like a slap, because they were entirely fair and completely accurate. She'd been using their friendship as evidence that she could move on while never actually risking anything real, keeping Bert at arm's length where he couldn't hurt her, but also couldn't actually reach her. "I don't want to lose you," Cynthia had whispered, "but I'm terrified of trying and watching it fall apart." "Then maybe you need to decide what scares you more. The possibility of getting hurt again, or the certainty of being alone because you never gave anyone a chance." That conversation had been a turning point. Cynthia had started therapy the following week with a woman who specialized in trust issues and relationship trauma, working through layers of abandonment and betrayal that stretched back to childhood. She'd learned to separate Bert from the men who'd failed her, to recognize that her fear was valid, but letting it control her entire life was just another form of letting Clyde win. She and Bert had begun dating properly 3 months ago, slowly, with painfully honest communication, working through her trust issues and his fear of loving someone and losing them again to circumstances beyond control. There were setbacks and difficult conversations and moments when Cynthia's instinct to run nearly overwhelmed her commitment to stay and fight for something good. But Bert had been patient without being a doormat, clear about his needs without being demanding, and honest about his own fears in ways that made vulnerability feel like strength rather than weakness. Now standing in the construction site that would become the Margaret Chen Community Centre, named for her mother, funded by her inheritance, designed to offer exactly the kind of support her mother never had, Cynthia felt pieces of herself aligning into something coherent and purposeful. The building was early 20th century architecture, all soaring ceilings and original crown molding beneath decades of neglect. She'd purchased it for $200,000 from a city desperate to see the historic structure renovated rather than demolished. Another $3 million in renovation costs would transform it into something extraordinary. The main floor would house free financial literacy courses for women rebuilding after divorce or abandonment. The second floor would offer small business mentorship and resources for entrepreneurs who couldn't access traditional banking. The third floor would provide legal aid consultations and therapeutic support groups. Everything her mother had needed 40 years ago when Cynthia's father disappeared, leaving a young woman alone with a 4-year-old daughter and no resources except determination. Bert walked through the construction site beside her, hard hat slightly crooked on his head, asking detailed questions about her vision with the genuine interest of someone who cared about her dreams as much as his own. "The main hall will be beautiful once it's restored," he observed, looking up at coffered ceilings currently covered in construction dust and scaffolding. "Are you thinking modern furniture or something that matches the historic character?" "Mix of both," Cynthia explained, pointing to architectural drawings spread across a makeshift table. "Historic preservation where it matters, modern functionality where it's needed, like honoring the past while building something new." Bert smiled at the metaphor that probably wasn't accidental. They'd reached the main hall, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, light streaming through glass that would be replaced next month with energy-efficient panels that looked identical to the originals. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression shifting into something serious and slightly nervous. "Cynthia, I have something to ask you." She tensed instinctively, old habits dying hard, her body preparing for disappointment or complication, even as her rational mind knew Bert had never been anything but reliable. "I know you value directness," Bert continued, pulling off his hard hat and setting it aside. "So I'm just going to say it without elaborate setup or manipulation. Marry me." Cynthia stared at him, genuinely stunned into silence. Her mouth opened and closed without producing sound, her brain struggling to process words she'd never expected to hear again. Never wanted to hear again after Clyde, except suddenly she wanted them desperately from this specific man. "Bert, we've only been officially together for 8 months. 8 months of dating, 12 months before that as friends," he interrupted gently. 20 months total of me getting to know the most remarkable woman I've ever met. I'm 52 years old. I buried my first wife and learned exactly how short and fragile life actually is. I know I don't want to waste another day of it not being fully committed to you." He took her hand carefully, his grip warm and steady. "I love you, Cynthia. I love your strength and your sharp edges and the way you refuse to let anyone make you small. I love that you turned grief and betrayal into this." He gestured around the construction site, "into something that will help thousands of people build better lives. I love that you're brave enough to let me see you scared and trust me anyway." His voice softened. "But if you need more time, I'll wait. I just needed you to know where I stand. That I'm all in completely, whenever you're ready." Cynthia felt tears, real ones, not from grief but from overwhelming emotion that felt like breaking open and being rebuilt simultaneously. She thought about Clyde's proposal 9 years ago in a crowded restaurant designed for Instagram photos and maximum attention, where he'd performed love for an audience while never actually seeing her clearly. Bert was offering something entirely different: quiet certainty, patient devotion, Partnership built on genuine knowledge of who she actually was, including all her damage and walls and sharp protective edges. She thought about her mother living alone for decades after being abandoned, building wealth in silence, trusting no one, surviving, but never truly living fully or openly. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, devastated, betrayed, believing she could never risk loving anyone again. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming with Bert beside her, someone who could be strong and vulnerable simultaneously, who could build empires while also building a life, who could survive trauma without letting it permanently define every choice. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger, her voice steady with absolute certainty. "Yes, Bert, I'll marry you." His face broke into a smile so genuine and unguarded, it made her heart ache with the realization that this was real, this was safe, this was someone who saw her completely and chose her anyway. He pulled her close, kissing her while construction workers politely pretended not to notice, while dust motes danced in afternoon light, streaming through windows that overlooked the river, while the building that would become her mother's legacy rose around them like proof that destruction could transform into creation if you survived long enough to rebuild. When they finally pulled apart, Bert laughed slightly, shaking his head. "I was terrified you'd say no, or that you'd need 3 more years to think about it." "I probably should need more time," Cynthia admitted. "But I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. I'm tired of protecting myself so completely that nothing good can reach me either. You make me want to be brave." "You've always been brave," Bert corrected. "You just finally found someone worthy of that bravery." They stood together in the shell of a building being transformed from neglect into purpose, and Cynthia felt her mother's presence like a benediction. Proud, satisfied, relieved that her daughter had finally learned the lessons that had taken 40 years and immeasurable wealth to teach. Strength wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was also about being brave enough to open yourself to someone who'd earned that vulnerability through consistent action and honest devotion. Her mother had survived alone. But Cynthia could do something her mother never managed. Survive and thrive and build something beautiful with someone who understood that partnership meant standing beside each other through construction and destruction both, never abandoning ship when circumstances turned difficult. As they left the building, Bert's hand in hers, Cynthia looked back at the structure that would bear her mother's name and silently promised to live the life her mother had made possible, fully, bravely, without letting past pain permanently close her to future joy. The building was rising. Her life was rising. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Cynthia felt genuinely excited about the future, rather than just grimly determined to survive it. Chapter 10. The Empire of Love. The wedding took place on a crystalline October afternoon at Bert's ranch in Montana, 14 months after Cynthia had buried her mother and discovered both devastating betrayal and impossible wealth on the same terrible day. But the story didn't begin at the ranch. It began 3 weeks earlier, on the morning the Margaret Chen Community Center officially opened its doors. Cynthia stood in the main hall at 6:30 in the morning, watching sunrise light stream through restored floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space transformed from neglected ruin into something that would change lives. The original crown molding gleamed after months of careful restoration. Hardwood floors reflected morning light like mirrors. Modern workstations lined walls beneath historic architectural details, honoring past while building future. The first woman arrived at 7 o'clock. Maria Santos, 43, recently divorced after her husband emptied their joint accounts and disappeared across state lines. She carried a folder containing documents she didn't understand and fear she couldn't hide. "I heard you help women like me," Maria said quietly. "Women who trusted the wrong person and lost everything." Cynthia recognized herself in Maria's exhausted eyes. "We do more than help. We teach you to rebuild stronger than before. Come inside." By 8 o'clock, the financial literacy classroom held 12 women ranging from 25 to 68. Some were recently divorced, Others had been widowed and discovered their husbands had hidden catastrophic debt. Several had escaped abusive relationships with nothing but their lives and whatever they could carry. Cynthia taught the first class herself, sharing principles her mother had lived by. Wealth isn't about how much you earn. It's about what you keep, how you protect it, and who you trust with knowledge of it. Financial independence isn't optional. It's survival. She watched women take notes like their lives depended on remembering every word, because their lives actually did depend on it. This was her mother's legacy, made tangible, not just money, but knowledge that could compound across generations if these women taught their daughters what they'd learned. The second floor buzzed with activity by mid-morning. Small business consultations happened in offices where entrepreneurs learned about LLC formation, business banking, and protecting personal assets from business liability. Women who'd been told they were too old, too broke, too damaged to start over were writing business plans and learning that survival could transform into success with proper guidance. The third floor offered legal aid and therapy groups. Women processed trauma while simultaneously building practical skills for reconstruction, pain acknowledged, then channeled into forward motion rather than paralyzing grief. By noon, Cynthia walked through every floor, observing transformation happening in real time. In the main hall, a support group discussed rebuilding credit after financial abuse. In a small conference room, a woman practiced salary negotiations for the first time in her life. In the computer lab, someone learned basic accounting software that would help her track every dollar and ensure no one could steal from her again. This was the empire her mother had envisioned. Not buildings and bank accounts, though those provided the foundation. The real empire was knowledge transferring from one generation of survivors to the next, breaking cycles of dependence and vulnerability that had trapped women for centuries. Bernard found her on the third floor, his weathered face showing something close to wonder. Your mother would be extraordinarily proud. You took her silence and isolation and transformed it into community and voice. She survived alone because she had to, Cynthia replied. These women will survive together because they can. The center's impact rippled outward faster than Cynthia had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, the waiting list held over 300 names. Media coverage brought attention and additional funding. Other cities reached out asking how to replicate the model. Bert's venture capital firm committed $5 million to creating satellite centers in 4 additional states. We're building something that will outlive us, Bert said one evening as they reviewed expansion plans, something that changes fundamental power dynamics for thousands of women. Tens of thousands eventually, Cynthia corrected. This is just the beginning. Now, 3 weeks after opening day, she stood at Bert's Montana ranch, preparing to marry the man who understood that her strength wasn't something to manage or diminish. It was something to celebrate and amplify. 50 guests attended. People who'd earned their places through genuine connection rather than obligation. Angela, her mother's closest friend, walked her down an aisle between hay bales decorated with autumn wildflowers. Bert waited at the altar, crying unashamedly, and when Cynthia reached him, he whispered, "You're magnificent." The vows they'd written together were promises built on truth rather than fantasy. Bert spoke first, his voice steady despite tears. "Cynthia, I don't promise to save you. You already saved yourself. I promise to stand beside you while you build empires and change lives. I promise to see you clearly every day, exactly as you are, and choose you anyway. I promise to be worthy of the trust you're giving me, knowing exactly how much it costs you. And I promise I will never let you stand alone at the hard moments." Cynthia's hands shook slightly as she responded, "Bert, you taught me that strength includes vulnerability. When you found someone worthy of it, you are worthy of every piece of me I thought I'd lost. I promise to love you fiercely. I promise to let you love me just as fiercely. I promise to keep building this life together, brick by honest brick, never running when things get complicated. And I promise to remember every day that choosing you was the bravest decision I've made since choosing to survive instead of staying broken." The reception stretched into evening under string lights and Montana stars. Bernard's toast made everyone laugh and cry. I met Cynthia on the worst day of her life. I watched her transform grief and betrayal into power and purpose. She didn't just survive, she conquered. Bert, you're not rescuing her. You're smart enough to recognize excellence and humble enough to stand beside it. To Cynthia and Bert, may you build something extraordinary together. Later, slow dancing to jazz music, Bert asked what she was thinking. I'm thinking about how Clyde said I'd never do better than him, that I needed him to be complete. She looked around at genuine friends, the foundation she'd built, the man holding her like she was precious. I'm thinking how catastrophically wrong he was, and how grateful I am he showed his truth before I wasted another decade. His loss is the greatest gift he accidentally gave me, Bert replied. They discussed expansion plans as evening deepened. The community center's success was already inspiring replication. Bert was redirecting his venture capital toward women-owned businesses. Together, they were creating systems that would help thousands rebuild lives after devastation. We will help thousands, Bert said, emphasizing certainty over possibility. Together. That's the entire point of this. As guests departed, Cynthia and Bert stood on the porch, watching stars emerge across vast Montana sky. Any regrets? Bert asked quietly. Cynthia thought about the year that had transformed her. Betrayal, revenge, learning to trust again, risking love after devastating loss. Not a single one. Every painful moment taught me something essential. Even Clyde's betrayal was necessary for me to become who I actually am. Bert kissed her slowly, and she knew this was what her mother had wanted. Partnership built on truth, love that saw her completely and chose her anyway. A man who celebrated her strength rather than feeling threatened by it. Somewhere far away, Clyde lived with consequences he'd earned. Manual labor, aging truck, checking his ex-wife's social media despite knowing it would hurt. But that story was finished. This story, the empire of love and purpose she was building, was beginning. Her mother had survived alone, building wealth in silence, protecting herself through isolation. Cynthia was writing a different ending, strong enough to be vulnerable, wealthy enough to be generous, secure enough to risk loving completely. She'd inherited her mother's empire. Now she was building her own, one that included partnership, purpose, and the revolutionary act of letting someone love her exactly as she was. The real empire wasn't just wealth or power. It was freedom to choose love after betrayal, courage to build after destruction, wisdom to know that the greatest revenge wasn't making someone pay. It was living so well they became completely irrelevant to your happiness. She thought about Maria Santos and the 11 other women in that first morning class, taking notes like their lives depended on it. Thought about the 300 names on the waiting list, the satellite centers being planned, the generations of women who would learn that financial independence wasn't optional, it was survival. Her mother had built an empire in silence. Cynthia was building hers with purpose and voice and community. The Margaret Chen Community Center was already changing lives daily. Next year, 4 more centers would open. Within 5 years, the network would span 15 cities. But tonight, she was simply a woman who'd survived everything meant to break her and emerged stronger, wealthier, wiser, and loved exactly as she deserved. Bert waited in the doorway, hand extended. Cynthia took it without hesitation and stepped inside to begin the rest of her life, not defined by survival or revenge, but by what she'd built from the ashes. The story that began with dirt on a black dress and betrayal through a phone call ended here, with love earned through honesty, partnership built on truth, legacy constructed brick by brick, and a future so bright she needed both hands to hold all the possibilities. She was ready. The end.